Hi, everybody. We're going to get started. Oh, wow. Thank you for coming. Just a couple quick things, and then we'll have a more formal introduction of our speaker tonight. This is the 150th anniversary of our school. This is one of many small events we'll do over the course of the semester. There are more things we'll do with the students shortly. We had an alum event and an AIA event earlier. This is a kickoff lecture for a workshop that our speaker tonight is going to do. And we'll do another workshop next weekend, and I'll tell you about that. So tonight, our introducer is Jess Myers. She is a recent addition to our faculty. I want to just take 2 seconds and say that she's also going to be giving a lecture next Friday, and she's going to be giving a workshop next Friday. But Jess joined us this year from RISD. She and Evelyn are both giving podcast workshops in these 2 weeks. The one for tomorrow that will be given by Evelyn, and she'll be introduced shortly, is going to focus on using podcasting as a tool and as a technique for storytelling and business development. And Jess is going to give a podcast workshop and lecture beginning next Friday, focused on using sound and podcasting as a research tool. So I'm not going to say anything more except thank you all for coming. And I'm going to turn it over now to Jess Meyer, who's going to give a more formal and more articulate introduction than I have just done. Jess Myers. You could give her a round of applause. Yeah. No, you.
Okay, hey everyone. I just wanted to start out acknowledging with respect the Onondaga Nation, firekeepers of the Haudenosaunee, the indigenous people on whose ancestral lands Syracuse University now stands. And I also want to introduce the Ahern Lecture Series, of which this is the second. The series is really meant to provide students with the opportunity to build skill sets that are often outside of a typical architecture curriculum. So that's why we're focusing on this 2 series of podcasts this time. So I'm now going to introduce the illustrious Evelyn Lee, who is FAIA, NOMA, and from the AIA San Francisco and AIA California chapters, who was also elected president of the AIA starting in 2025. She is currently vice president-elect for 2024 of the AIA's extremely Baroque leadership cycle. She is also the first ever global head of workspace strategy and innovation at Slack Technologies. She is founder of the Practice of Architecture. She is co-host of the podcast Practice Disrupted. Lee seamlessly integrates her business and architecture background with a qualitative and quantitative focus to build a better experience for the organization's employees, clients, and guests. Lee has also served as AIA's national treasurer. She has served as the vice president of communications and public affairs. She is the only fellow who has received both the National Associates Award and Young Architects Award, and the only member to have served as chair of the National Associates Committee and the Young Architects Forum. She received her BArch from Drury University. She received her MArch from SciArc, and she also holds a Master of Public Administration and a Master's of Business Administration in Sustainable Management from Preciado Graduate School. She's widely published. You can find her works in Contract Magazine, in Architect Magazine, and in Architizer. And just to introduce the podcast a little bit, it's currently on its 129th episode. Practice Disrupted focuses on how the evolution of architectural practice has been relatively slow towards change, yet modern shifts in business and design management have prompted today's leading architects to rethink how they work. On Practice Disrupted, Evelyn and her co-host Janine Chastain set out to illuminate the future of the profession to help architects remain relevant and valuable in a changing world. And just to give you a bit of a prelude of Evelyn's thinking, when she was running her successful campaign for AIA president, she was quoted saying, "We have the training our society so desperately needs to solve its most pressing challenges. The desire for transformation in our industry is so great, and I believe that I'm the right leader to empower our members to meet that moment." So without further ado, let's turn it over to Evelyn.
Thank you so much for taking your, what's today, Friday, on homecoming weekend and spending it here with me. I wanted to, oh, come on. Okay, jump in with a question just to find out who's here. So a little bit of interaction. So what year are you guys? So I know Syracuse is a big undergrad program. Any first years? Their heads down somewhere or somewhere else. Second? A lot of second years. Way to show up. Third? Fourth? Fifth? Grad? Nice, thank you. So what are you guys interested in hearing a little bit about? Are you guys gonna be super shy? Are you interested, how many of you are interested in alternative careers? Or how many of you are interested in hearing, well, how many of you are interested in hearing about podcasting? I guess is one of the questions I should ask. Yeah, so some, okay. So a little bit about me. Do any of you follow Dank Lloyd Wright on Instagram? Yeah? So Dank Lloyd Wright put together this of me, thought I'd share, against the two biggest blockbuster hits this summer. So they found out that I grew up in Los Alamos, New Mexico, and I, in fact, worked at the Los Alamos National Lab. I guess Barbie and I are both LinkedIn girl bosses, which I guess is a good place to be. And we're all three apparently a product of corporate America. This is how I like to draw my own Venn diagram. So I did grow up in Los Alamos. I learned how to code my first website thanks to my mom in HTML way back in 4th grade when there was no drag and drop website builders back then, like Square. I have my architecture degree, and I'm also a mom of a 6 and an 8-year-old at home. So I work now at Slack as the head of workplace strategy and experience. I don't do real estate anymore. I don't do architecture. I don't do buildings. What I do is I work cross-functionally with the team that supports our employees to provide the best workplace environment to attract and retain the best employees. So a lot of the work that I do is asking our employees like what's bothering them, and hearing that they're in too many Zoom calls, for instance, and then figuring out how to eliminate Zoom calls, or listening to them about why they aren't coming back into the offices, and then helping the leadership team make a decision about, well, do we actually need them to come back into the offices? So that's where I kind of work in the technology space. I am happy to talk to anyone that's interested in UX design on the product side, but I don't actually work on the product side. And I also support the research behind the state of the work in 2023. And this really talks about how there is, not just in architecture, but in a lot of industries, a growing gap between what employees want and what the bosses want their employees to do, relative to return to office, relative to workplace culture, relative to overall mental health and wellness. So if you want to check out a report that I recently worked on, go check out the state of work in 2023. And then I also started the practice of architecture. So I went back to school and I got my business degree, and I started reading all of these articles that I wish I had been taught in professional practice class, or that I wish I knew as an architect. And so practice of architecture ultimately started as just a curation of things that I wish I knew architects knew more about. Right now, it runs as a consultancy to small and medium-sized business practices. And ultimately, we're working on setting it up as a venture capital fund to fund new ideas that are coming out of architecture firms. So this is my history, Drury undergrad, SciArc grad. And this is really a presentation about the path that I took. So I worked at a company called WD Partners. So I did actually work in architecture, doing site adapts for Home Depot, which is not very fun, but it is a job that you can have when you graduate. I can tell you the difference between a regular depot and what we used to joke was a cheapo depot. I can tell you whether the floor plan has been mirrored, depending on what side the construction yard is on. Spent a year doing Home Depots. I also worked at Perkins and Eastman, or at a firm that got acquired by Perkins and Eastman called Dougherty and Dougherty Architects, doing a lot of K through 12 and community buildings, because I thought being closer to doing these type of environments, and building environments that house the future educational environments of the future of our population would be really meaningful to me. But what I found out is, especially in California, architects don't get to talk to the students a lot about the schools that they build. I think you'd be surprised. And the way that the environment is when you get out into the real world is that architecture projects are given to contractors who put in the lowest bid to win the public project. So that means that as long as they're qualified. So my experience working in schools is dealing with contractor lawyers who are constantly looking for errors in our drawings to change order their way to a profit, since they came in and they bid so low. And it was environments like that that actually made me question my ability as an architect to move the industry forward, and whether or not I wanted to stay in architecture. In the meantime, because I needed a more creative outlet, I do love to write. So I started writing for Habitat before writing for a blog was a thing, and people could make a living off of it. Really interested in sustainable design and where that was headed. And then I moved out of traditional practice in 2005, and I went and worked for a nonprofit organization called Public Architecture. It no longer exists. Similar to Architecture for Humanity, but it was really encouraging architecture firms to give some of their hours towards the public good pro bono, with the hope that collectively we would have the largest pro bono architecture shop in the world if we add up all those firms. What I found out, though, is that these firms, it was before the Great Recession, these firms were giving away all of their hours, but they were having problems talking to nonprofits about work, because nonprofits think architects can only do ground-up buildings. So a lot of the conversations that I was having with nonprofits was talking about what architects can do, how we can help them meet fundraising goals, how we can help them operationalize kind of how they move throughout the space better. And I realized that architecture school hadn't given me the vocabulary necessary to talk to these nonprofit organizations about the value that architects can deliver, which is ultimately why I went and I got my MBA. And I ended up at the Presidio Graduate School. And that's, like I said, when I started practice of architecture. And after I got out of the Presidio Graduate School, I ended up at a place called MK Think. Now, MK Think is a design and architecture practice at its heart. It was founded by 3 architects, but they founded what was called a strategy studio. So if you guys think about the regular construction architecture process, you have schematic design, design development, CDs, project delivery, construction, and that's where architects tend to operate. That's what I would call traditional practice. The strategy studio specifically looked at how to expand the services that architects were offering to clients both before and after traditional practice. What we found is, because we were doing stuff that was closer to what the big consulting firms like BCG and McKinsey and Deloitte do, is that we were actually able to charge more on an hourly rate than we were for our architecture fees. So the strategy group got paid more. We had a little bit better work-life balance. And that kind of became my transition into everything that I talk about how we need to change and evolve the culture of architecture so that especially all the Gen Zers that are graduating into the workplace can really find a place that they can have a fulfilling career, but also life outside of work. And that's a lot about what I talk about as president of the AIA and where I believe this profession needs to head. So I wrote a lot for Contract Magazine in that time, focused on business practice. And I worked as a workplace strategy. These are two corporate brokerage firms. So before the pandemic was happening, I was working as a workplace strategist, helping individuals like the Nature Conservancy who wanted to grow their funds, but most corporations, behind the cost that they spend on people, so behind the cost they spend on talent, the second biggest bucket outside of data these days is real estate. So we worked with a lot of companies that didn't want to grow their real estate company, but still wanted to expand their services and what they were doing. So it was a lot of moving people out of desks into hoteling desk situations and kind of all the change management that a lot of companies are working through right now was relative to return to office and more distributed work teams. So these are some of the articles that I wrote for architects, very much about how we do this in a way that maintains it's how do we take the lessons learned from other industries and apply it back to architecture in a way that we build an industry and a profession where we all find a place and we all can pay down the student loans that we acquire in business school, and be successful and feel fulfilled in our careers, rather than kind of the rhetoric of the undercurrent of architects being overworked, underpaid, and undervalued. And I ended up at Slack doing a lot of the same things, and I already kind of talked about what I do at Slack, so I'm gonna skip that. This is Practice Disrupted, it's practicedisrupted.com. So we talk to a lot of architects who, we have a series called The Future of Voices in the Profession, and we talk to a lot of architects who have various different cultural backgrounds about their journey through the industry and kind of the barriers that they've had to face. We also we have a whole Architecture And series that looks at architects that have gone off and done different things. One of the coolest interviews from our first season actually was somebody who does production design now for Disney on Obi-Wan and all the Star Wars movies, so or the Star Wars series, so another path for architects. But really we're talking about how do we expand and define what it means to be an architect, as well as architectural practice. And then this is where I'm currently writing. So I'm currently doing a lot of writing for Architizer, lots and lots of commentary on how the culture of architecture needs to evolve. And this is kind of my career path all in one. So here's my job/school career path. Here's how writing has encompassed that. And the AIA, oddly enough, has been a second home for me. So what the AIA has provided me as a membership organization is a place to learn and grow and test things that I wasn't able to, do in the firm. To run committees, to try out leadership skills and grow that way. And now the AIA has become a really great platform to talk about how our industry needs to evolve. And I often say that my critique of the AIA, my critique of the profession is out of the love for the people in the profession and what we want to do to change the world and make it better. And I believe that we can get there, but I believe we need to get there by evolving practice as it is now. And that's it. Oh, there's some other things. But we can turn that off now. Go back. I was going to turn this. I was just going to.
Go get yours.
Thanks so much, Evelyn. That was lovely.
Okay. Thank you.
I'm going to start with a couple of questions
Yeah.
to give you guys time to percolate your many, many, many interesting questions.
That was a good hint.
That was like a, you get 'em on deck. One of the questions that I have for you is, it seems a thread that comes through your work, all of your work, is really thinking about different ways that practices can model themselves, alternative models, and really an understanding for what are your values in business, right? So I'd be curious if you were to bring that back into an architecture school, into a course like ProPrac, for example.
Yeah.
What is one thing, or maybe one or two things you would add to ProPrac that would prepare students for this future of practice that you're envisioning?
Well, it's not on the fault of any professional practice professors out there, because they're teaching towards the NAB accreditation process. But I think it's really about being a lot more entrepreneurial. One of the things that I find a lot of architects doing by nature, and I don't know if it's the competitiveness that we had in school and studio, but there's an overall lack to share with one another that is completely different in the business school environment when it comes to talking about ideas, kind of internal critiques, and the idea that, like, if you speak your idea out there, then you need to be the first one to deliver on it to make it a successful business, is like a very different mindset than I'm going to keep all my ideas inside me so no one else gets to see it. So for me, it's just like, how do we change the mindset to create a community of sharing and caring? Sorry, my vocabulary evolves around my 6 and 8 year-olds these days, so sharing and caring. But also, just how do you be more entrepreneurial, and what are the different paths that you can use? A little bit more in alternative paths too in architecture.
And this is the last question I'm going to ask, and then get ready. It seems like the podcast really speaks to that. It creates a space of community around which people can talk about or expose things that they've been working on in the background. Can you speak a little bit more to what inspired you to start the podcast, and also, since you are on 129 episodes, how that podcast has changed over time?
Yeah, I think it was opportunistic. So I will say, one of the things about speaking your ideas to fruition is I told an individual, Mark LePage, I don't know, many years before I started the podcast, that I always thought about doing a podcast. But being an architect, I didn't want to put something out there that was half delivered, right? And I didn't have the time to learn about podcasting. So when Mark decided to launch a podcasting network, he said, hey, do you want to launch your network on it? Do you want to build a podcast on it? We'll take care of the production side. And it was also in the middle of the pandemic, and there was a lot of architects struggling with what to do within their firms. So that kind of became a place to start having our conversations about how architecture needs to change while firms were being forced into this change with everyone working from home. I think how it's evolved over time is that Janine and I felt that we were very much alone in our thinking. With a podcast, you kind of put it out into the world, and you don't know who's listening on the other end until those listeners start talking back to you. And what we found has been amazing is the community behind the podcast. And people and professional practice professors who now make their students go listen to the podcast. So right now we feel kind of a great responsibility to end each episode with kind of a call to action about how you can take what you learn in the podcast and then either implement it in your firm, implement it in your own career path, but how do you really begin to action against all of this change that we want to happen? And I think that's kind of the underlying thread of this season.
now. Guys, you had all this lead time. Come on.
This is kind of a specific question, but would you recommend, or how necessary do you think getting an MBA was to your like career path, or like working in consulting or a more entrepreneurial role as an architect?
So I've talked, a lot of people ask me this, like, do you need to go and get an MBA? There's a lot of different learning methods out there right now. There's this program called like the Quantic MBA, which is entirely online. Go look it up. I know it's a weird name. I think the value you get out of an MBA really depends on kind of what you hope to get out of the MBA and where you were in life. I was at a place where I wanted to take a break from architecture, but I didn't know what was next. I was completely unattached, and I just kind of went out and applied to every school in a city that I wanted to live in, and took my first year getting an MBA as a break. I took a break. I didn't sign up for the real estate clubs that they have. I didn't sign up for any green building or sustainable clubs I had. For me, it was really an exploration of, do I want to do something different? So it was a personal journey for me. And in coming out of that journey, I found my way back to practice in a way, and definitely back to the AIA, because I missed this family of support that I found before that I went into the MBA. But it also helped me refine this message of how I believe architects need to change and evolve. There's definitely programs out there where you can understand the financing, marketing, business development of a firm without going and getting your MBA. There's definitely programs out there where you can actually learn about going into the VC, the venture cap side of things, and transitioning without getting an MBA. So for me, it's like I feel like I need to create like a personal checklist for anyone who's making this decision. But it's very personal for me. The other thing about any education that you get, be it architecture or business, is that there's so much that continues to happen as an adult, and you continue to learn, and technologies change over time, so architects are constantly learning. So even though I got my MBA, there's things that I'm learning now about influencer marketing that just never existed when I got my MBA. So it's a constant learning cycle too. Are you usually this quiet? Is it because it's a Friday on homecoming? It's like a full moon that I'm not unaware of. Is it a full moon? Nicole confirmed it's a full moon.
Thank you. Thank you for the lecture, and I'm always interested to hear people discuss about kind of alternative ways of practice and kind of working within the field while still doing something different. And I was really interested when you spoke about kind of the cultural differences between architecture school and business school, and the kind of attitudes towards sharing ideas and how one works through a project. And I was curious if you could speak a little bit more about that, and kind of I'm a fifth year student, and I'm about to kind of embark on more professional work. What are kind of some things or some things to read that I could think about more that relate to these things we're maybe missing in architecture school?
Yeah, I think I made a reference to it being. I think the cultural difference between architecture school and learning, and like for an example, a technology company, and how they approach business. I don't know if it started in school, but a for instance would be in architecture firms. This is broad generalizations. There are incredible architecture firms out there. You often hear about how you throw the interns into the deep end and see if they can swim. You often hear about how you need to earn your way to a client meeting. You often hear about you need to, also you need to learn to walk before you can run, I think is a terminology that gets said in architecture firms by a lot of older generation leaders. My first day on the job at Slack, they said, you are here because we selected you through the candidate process to be here. I don't care. In my orientation process, we had interns. We also had senior vice presidents that was all going through the same orientation. And they said, the CEO, Stuart Butterfield, said, I don't care if you're just out of school. I don't care if you have 20 years of experience. We want you to tell us what we're doing wrong and what we can do better. And it's just such a different mindset than what I ever experienced in an architecture firm. And, but that's where I hope architecture firms go in the future. Because a lot of the students coming out of school know how to do so much more with technology than any of the leaders in our firm, and vice versa. I think the other industries are better set up for diverse, learning across generations, and helping one another succeed. Versus, I feel like architects, we tend to like to hold on to our own piece of the pie and not share. And I'm a firm believer of rising tides raise all ships. The only way to move the entire profession forward is to do it all together.
Thank you for your presentation. So my question is, you mentioned that architects are overworked and underpaid, and about the architecture industry as a whole, and also about business models that architecture firms can take apart from the conventional model. So what are some sort of things organizations like AIA or other architecture organizations are doing or are planning to do to help influence the industry to become more up to date with their workplace culture and just the industry as overall? How can the industry take a leap into the next sort of step? Because there, I believe, improvements that can be made in the industry. And what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, that was a lot of what I ran my platform on. I essentially said, every architecture firm is a business, and that in order for us to build the buildings that we want to build, we have to create successful businesses. And so my focus is really going to be on how do we create research and support and courses that really help hold up the business side of practice. If you look at historically what has been the learnings, the professional development learnings in firms, or even by the AIA, is how do you make the architecture project better? But I want to make the people experience within the firms better. So that's going to be my focus. And I think as an organization, the AIA can provide more resources around that. But really, our members haven't been asking for that, because our members ask about how to make their projects better. And I think this goes back to school and just not learning about business, and also in firms, people often learn from those who came before them. So if the person before them didn't feel a need to go outside and learn about how to manage highly successful teams and was focused on only the project, then that's what they taught their mentee, and that's what that person taught the next person. So I'm looking forward to potentially using my stance as the president to talk about the importance of that in the industry, and to create that groundswell, or hopefully we'll create more resources. And if not, and the AIA is already giving me a headache for this, That's why I launched the practice of architecture, to begin to create those resources for small and medium-sized businesses.
Hi, I just wanted to ask how you transitioned into writing about architecture. I'm not sure if you had a degree or some sort to back your skills or if it was just a passion, but how you were able to tell these magazines that, oh, I have something to contribute to this. And also, I had another question regarding that, is how you write about it. Is it kind of like new journalism where you insert yourself into it and you have sort of perspective, or if it's just solely about the project?
Yeah, so my writing has evolved over time, depending on what I'm most passionate about. So in Habitat, a lot of these online outlets are just looking for freelance authors. So you can mock up some articles, send it out to an editor and say, hey, I would like to cover the housing beat, whatever you want to do. That's essentially what I did for In Habitat. I wanted to cover sustainable architecture. All of the writing that I do now is around practice management and practice operations with a focus. So my primary audience that I'm speaking to is not clients, but it's actually firm leaders or individuals in firms. So it's very much taking all of these things that I'm saying and then putting them into articles. So not necessarily about buildings anymore. But all of my connections actually in the AIA were ultimately people who knew that I wrote and said, can you come write for us? So I was doing a lot of stuff on social media, more so than other architects were doing when I was writing for In Habitat, because we were trying to build the presence. So a friend of mine was working at Wiley Publishing at the time, and John Czarnecki, and he eventually became the editor of Contract Magazine. And we could never agree on writing a book about social media because I said it's changing too much. I don't want to write a book on something that's going to be obsolete in a year. But he came back around and said, can you write on all of this business stuff that you're talking about? And then when he left Contract Magazine, one of his editors also went to Architect Magazine, and she's like, hey, we don't have the content that you were putting out in Contract over on Architect Magazine. Are you willing to write for me? But it's really just about using and leveraging the AIA and the network that it has to create these connections and open doors for you. Uh-huh.
No, it's like it's a very short, and it's more curiosity. But you mentioned that part of your future projects is to fund research, right, for practices. I'm just curious, like what types of projects are you interested in funding? So there's a lot of VC funding, venture capital funding right now going into the AECO, so architecture, engineering, construction, and owner space right now. Billions and billions of dollars every year coming out of private equity and venture equity. Where are they?
So I'm interested, I have angel invested in a few companies, but I'm interested in sourcing new products and services that are coming out of architects that essentially create a more sustainable business model for them because they're not working on architectural projects. So it could be anything. It could be software. There's a lot of things going into construction tech right now. So I don't know if you guys have been following what Icon Technologies has been doing. But Icon is out of Texas. They've been 3D printing whole communities. And they also have, we're interviewing on the podcast Melody Yashar, who is known as a space architect. So they're thinking about how to take that 3D printing technology to Mars to build entire environments even before humans touch space on the planet. So, but those type of things, I would love to figure out like a way to elevate technologies, different mechanism for funding architecture projects, software. Those are the type of things that I would love to fund. You can't ask more than one question. Did you have any more questions?
I
Oh.
can we can keep talking about that.
Okay.
I'm just. Are there any examples of projects that have been pitched to you for funding, like coming from architecture offices? I'm just really curious because.
Yeah, no, I'm gonna open up. Can I open up my other presentation? So I just did another presentation talking about, oh, I'm sorry, I'm making you turn on the screen back on. Since you're curious about where this VC funding is going. If we can pull it up, we'll see. Oh, I need to exit out of this other presentation. As an example, okay, depending on time or how interesting you guys find this. So Layer is a VC-funded firm or a VC-funded software company that essentially takes data and sits it on top of your Revit model. So if you're out in the field, you can take a picture. If you have meeting notes on anything, you can connect it back to actual attributes in your Revit model, and all of your construction data and your project data exists there. Cove Tool was founded by an architecture and engineering husband and wife couple that worked for Perkins and Will and did all of these real intricate environmental modeling for their buildings. And they're like, if we want to move climate and the building environment forward and how we build more sustainably forward faster, then how do we replicate what we're doing using software and give that product to smaller architecture firms? So now that more people can do the same model and energy modeling that they were doing. Concert is funded by, they are going for their Series A, but they got their initial round of funding from a handful of large architecture firms looking at how architects track digital ownership of their documents now that everything is digital. So they were looking at using a blockchain ledger to track that, especially on the bigger complex projects around decisions. Hypar is looking at actually using generative AI in your Revit models. So a for instance would be, I don't know if you guys have seen the beta versions of Photoshop, where you can, put a rectangle over something and say, insert a reflection of this object here, insert people here. They're looking to do that within Revit. Insert an internal staircase here, and what are all the components of the architecture that need to line up to make an internal staircase happen between two floors. They're very new on the front end of that, but they also were doing a whole bunch of stuff using Grasshopper and building out tools on top of Revit for architecture firms. Monograph is a project management software designed by people who have backgrounds in architecture. Kanoa is founded by somebody who has a background in architecture. He worked for Shop Architects. He had a Revit consultancy that got acquired called Case, that got acquired by WeWork. And then he took the money and he founded Kanoa. So Kanoa allows your everyday office manager to upload a floor plan of their office and to drag and drop furniture onto the floor plan, and then it adjusts it to make sure you have clearance to go around all of the furniture, and so it has very limited machine learning in there around building codes. And then an office manager can click purchase, like you would shopping on Target, and they will come and install all the furniture that you purchase. And the other interesting thing about Kanoa is that they don't have any shows. They don't have any showrooms like manufacturers do, and they have this great second-hand market where anything that you've bought on the platform, you can put back on the platform second-hand and resell it to somebody else. So they're trying to do longer-term life cycle with Office too. Plant Prefab is not funded by an architect, but they're going into architecture. They're working with Brooks Scarpa. They've worked with Kieran Timberlake. If you want like a Brooks Scarpa designed home, prefabricated home, you can get it from Plant Prefab. Mighty Buildings is 2 engineering people that are going into architecture. They're 3D printed panels that then get assembled on site. Cottage is an all-in-one product that you can anyone who wants to purchase an ADU can go and get financing and design and implementation all from the same space. So they tend to hire architects 1099, but it's also a different way of working, right? So now you're not an architect going into a firm, you're an architect working as 1099 for a technology company. And then Test Fit was designed, this was actually, these guys started delivering this when they were in school. I think out of the Houston, they graduated from Houston. He spent a summer working with a developer, developing all these feasibility studies where he had to draw parking lots. I don't know if even in Revit and even in CAD, drawing parking lots is no fun. So they essentially developed a software that you can draw a polygon and it'll populate it, given building codes, with your parking lot for you. They've now since moved on to storage building and like multifamily housing building and hotels, anything where you actually have a repeatable model. You can drag and drop, and it'll tell you how many units you can fit into it, essentially. So those are the type of things that are coming out of the architecture.
Yeah, I'm wondering about the firm that you worked for that you said kind of started to compete with like the bigger consulting firms like BCG and McKinsey, and what kind of work did they do? If you could just talk more about that, and how did it differ from like a traditional consulting firm?
Yeah. Sorry. Those were the slides that I had on the back end of my other presentation. I'm prepared. Always be prepared. Let me see if I can exit out of this. So sometimes I get that question. So one of the most fun projects that I worked on was Sonoma County Library. So this was we were asked essentially, the libraries weren't being activated very much. So they asked us, how do we create programming to turn essentially, their strategic plan was how do you turn the library into the new community center? Because communities were also losing community centers. So with a lot of data and study about where their library card holders were, we did a study for each of the libraries looking at how population in that center was going to change over time. We looked at the different sites, the different types of furniture that they had in there. And we also looked at the different types of books that they had in their collection. And we essentially told the library that, your English as a second language collection should go to these 3 libraries, because that's where you have a lot of population supporting Sonoma County on the hospitality side, on the service side. So a lot of maid service, lawn care, et cetera, or supporting the wineries. But we essentially told them like where to move programming, and then spent a lot of time interviewing the community about what type of services they needed to support kids coming out of school, to keep teens busy, to make the library a fun place, like no longer a place that you get shushed in, but a place that you can go and have these Lego charrettes in, and have these build clubs. So, but we backed it by data findings and where people were. So then they were able to say with some kind of efficacy, you know, children programs at these libraries for this age group will be more successful than at other libraries. So that's kind of the work we did. And then within the building envelope, we kind of did a recommendation of like where programming fell. We were also hired by another architecture firm who was specifically asked by the client, University of California, Santa Cruz, to hire somebody else to do this, to talk about what type of floor plate should they be building for their graduate students. So the committee behind it said, oh, graduate students have gone off on the world. They want their own individual apartments. So they were originally designing individual apartments. So we did a whole stakeholder engagement. We literally had a build your own apartment game. We gave them amenities. We put points behind it. We called them, you had to pay for them in slugs. They each got so many slugs because the mascot there was the banana slug. And then they came back, and I didn't put that slide in here, but they came back and they said essentially, and by the way, here, I'll leave this up. Is my contact information if you want to email me. But they essentially came back and said, we came to graduate school for this community experience to learn from one another. So while we want our own room, we don't want our own apartment, and we want more communities. So we saved the university from spending a ton of money on these individually built apartment buildings, and rather created something that the graduate students wanted. And this is not dissimilar from the type of work that BCG, Deloitte, and McKinsey are doing. There's actually, if you look at the history of all the big consulting firms right now, there's been a lot of acquisition of design firms. And how do you apply design and design thinking across what they're offering? So that's another area that architects can go into. But again, that's kind of what we're working on. Sorry, these are all very long questions, but you guys don't have, or answers, but since you guys don't have a lot of questions, I guess. Okay, yeah. End it? Okay. Thank you so much. Yeah.